Welcome to the Modern Intimacy Podcast, a show about mental health, sex, relationships, education and tips, and those private things we need to talk about more publicly without restrictions. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Balestrieri. A licensed psychologist, certified sex therapist, packed couples therapist, and sex addiction therapist, I know that mental health is directly tied to the quality of our relationships and our sex lives. I'm passionate in my desire to smash stigmas and shine a light on societal issues that may be negatively affecting our lives, relationships, and sexuality. During this podcast, I will also give you practical answers and insights to questions you've been wondering about. We should all have fulfilled, happy lives, and we get there by erasing shame, consciously digging deeper, building healthy connections, and by getting curious together. Thanks for joining me. Let's get started. Welcome to the Modern Intimacy Podcast. I'm Dr. Balestrieri. Thanks so much for joining today. We are starting season 2, and I am so excited. Today, we're going to be talking about why it can be so difficult for men to practice the very difficult art of being vulnerable. And I'm so excited to have with me on today's episode one of the clinicians who works at Modern Intimacy. Her name is Raquel VanLoon. Raquel, thanks so much for being here with me today.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this with you.
Yeah, you recently wrote an article about how to create safety for men to feel emotionally vulnerable. What was part of the reason that you chose to write this blog?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of my main reasons for wanting to write this for Modern Intimacy was because I have been noticing that there has been more and more of an issue with some of the male identified folks that I interact with. And I feel a main reason that this is because as a society, there are things that we are taught that fit into certain boxes, right? So with talking of the binary, so like boys and girls, and this starts as a very young age. So we all are socialized this way very young. So for example, boys are, go ahead.
Even before we're born, that socialization starts.
Yes, exactly. So we're taught that, boys go with the color blue, the girls are for pink. To be masculine means not to cry and man up. All of those things are really stated to boys at such a young age. And I would say on the opposite, for girls, we're told to embrace that emotional side, that it is more acceptable, that it's okay, versus if a man acts that way, it's a sign of weakness, right? And that stigma and stereotype can be so hurtful for men and cause a lot of conflicting feelings when what they're actually doing is being a human being, right? And they're just so normal, and it's sad.
It is. It's one of the biggest, I think, grifts of the patriarchy is this idea that men are not supposed to be emotional, because to be emotional is a biological human imperative. We are born with the capacity for emotions because our emotions are an important source of information for us about how to navigate the world around us. And when men are conditioned away from their own emotional experience with that idea that it's a weak thing or they're less of a man or all of the really hurtful things that boys and men are told, it gives them just such a difficult time understanding and accessing their feelings in a way that allows them to feel okay in their own skin. And that's just such a trauma, I would say, for so many men, even though it may not register as one in the moment.
I agree. And that was like that other big piece of why I wanted to write this, because I want and I hope for these conversations to start somewhere as a way to start paving way for change.
I love that. Last week, in anticipation of this episode, I ran a poll on my Instagram channel asking men why it was hard for them to be vulnerable. Would you like to hear what some of them had to say?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to thank everybody who did take the time to respond. Your answers really shed a lot of light on the topic. And, whenever we're talking about a group of people, it's important to source that group of people for their opinions and their lived experiences. And some of what I heard were things like, I don't like to be vulnerable because the response you get from a lot of people isn't positive. Um, because men are supposed to be seen as the hunter or defender. And even though that's old fashioned, that's my fear that I won't be seen that way. Yeah. One person wrote, nothing gets in the way for me. It's beautiful to be vulnerable. It's just painful if the person doesn't give a damn. Oh, that's so painful. Yeah.
Yeah.
One person said, people trying to force you to do it when you don't want to be vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah. The one that stood out for me was it degrades the value in a relationship or when it is stored and weaponized later. And
Mm,
that's also a very valid point because I've also heard men tell me that when they have tried to be vulnerable, it ends up getting thrown into their face later during some other argument or any other conversation.
that's a common fear and unfortunately a common situation that happens to people of all genders when they are
Mhm.
vulnerable. You know, we don't hold vulnerability as precious as we could or as we need to as human beings. And when folks are vulnerable with us, it can sometimes elicit a feeling inside of like being helpless or powerless, or even feeling shame because we don't know what to do to help someone. And I think it's those kinds of reactions that lead people later to um, just being unkind or weaponizing someone's vulnerability against them. And I think the more that men start to practice vulnerability and get comfortable in knowing that it is a right as a human being to be vulnerable, my hope is that they'll be able to call out anybody who doesn't honor their vulnerability in the way it's meant to be cherished.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, what as a therapist have you seen getting in the way for men when they try to express vulnerability?
Yeah, a major obstacle definitely I would like to lead off of a little bit of what I said earlier of like with those boxes of like that we are put in as a society of
Hmm.
how we should behave in quotes, right? Like how we should behave, how we should carry ourselves. And that holds so true into how we carry ourselves like into adulthood. So like I'll use like a quick example for somebody who grows up really tightly with religious ties, right? Like as we grow older, even if we may not like that, even though we may not act in accordance with those anymore, sometimes what we are taught at such a young age are so interconnected and intertwined with us that
Hmm.
if we have sex outside of marriage or masturbate or any of that, right? Like some of that shame or guilt can still be connected to that. And
Hmm.
the reason why I use that example with this is because when men internalize that feeling of this is how I should be, that when they do act, like maybe when they do cry or when they do want like a shoulder to cry on, right? They may have that internalized feeling of shame or guilt, which makes it harder then to be vulnerable. And that's an
Hmm.
internal struggle, right?
Hmm.
But I would also say those traditional male ideals of what it means to be a man, right? So being the breadwinner, being the strong one, a lot of men, that's how they get their value from themselves, but
Hmm.
also how they feel like externally, how they get value.
Hmm.
So that can also be many different conflicting emotions, especially like if they're in like a cis het relationship, right? Like if their female partner makes more than they do, you know, and I would say if that works for the coupleship and works for the dynamic, that's great, right? But internally, some men do struggle with that.
Sure, and it's not just connected to financial achievements or earnings. You know, any kind of situation that might evoke vulnerability or insecurity or any kind of feeling of being not good enough or not measuring up, I think can create that dynamic where it can compound a man's fears around being vulnerable in his primary relationship or with friends or with family or society in general. I think one of the things I heard you say is that sometimes and this is my language, so if it doesn't fit, push back on it, please. But
Yeah.
when you use the example of sort of growing up with a more, I'll say, intense form of religion, sometimes we don't realize the effects of that indoctrination on our identities until much later, if ever, right? And even though somebody might step away from their religious upbringings, it can still be a part of how they see themselves or part of how they've understood the world, right? And so the
Yeah.
same is true when we think about the ways that we are socialized into a gender identity. And so for so many men, they may not consciously believe or identify with some of these, what's sort of in pop culture called toxic masculinity, but what we call precarious masculinity academically. They might not identify with a lot of those things, but not really have had the opportunity to understand the ways that it's kind of seeped into their identity. And then when they're asked to be vulnerable, either because they're asking themselves to be, or it's being asked of them in a context, it can sometimes feel like a betrayal to their masculinity, I think. And even though they may want to be vulnerable, they may want nothing more than to be vulnerable and to be able to be held in that way, emotionally or physically. Um, they really struggle with, understanding that they can trust any of that holding, and also later still be seen as somebody who is strong, who is a protector, who is somebody competent and worthy in this other way that they've learned and have been conditioned to believe that they must be.
Yeah, that was beautifully said and beautifully interpreted. That was everything that I was saying. And I think it is very hard, right, to feel like you're not fitting within those lines. And
Mm-hmm.
that betrayal of that masculinity ideally that's a huge kick to like your self-esteem too, and how you carry yourselves, how you relate to others, and being able to be authentic. You almost feeling like
Mm-hmm.
you have to be somebody else.
Totally, totally. I liken it to an old metaphor that I heard a long time ago. I don't know the original source, but if anyone listening knows it, please drop it in the comments on our website so I can cite them appropriately, please. But it's an old metaphor about how when we are sort of sitting with the context of fear or courage, right, and having to make that decision, imagine that you are on a horse and you've just ridden up to a forest that's on fire. And you know that there are people inside who can't get out without your help. So, which is the more courageous position? Is it to go into the fire to rescue them, or is it to ride away on your steed? And what do you think?
Hmm. That's a hard question. That is, yeah, that is very hard.
Yeah, most people might say it's more courageous to ride into the flames. And I think about
Yeah,
that as it relates to vulnerability too. Vulnerability is really scary, and we have an opportunity to lean into it, and we might get a little singed and we might get a little scuffed up, but there's good stuff in there that's worth leaning into. And it's much safer sometimes to lean away from vulnerability and to ride that horse far and fast.
of
But
course.
but when we lean into it, we end up being able to feel so much stronger in the end, right? And so much more composed and grateful and whole. And I think that's an important piece to really think about. It's scary, but it's brave to lean into it.
Yeah, and I think I really do like that metaphor of like with the fire, because it is going to feel uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
when men do first start to lean into that vulnerability. It is going to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean that's very powerful.
Yeah. Well, let's think a little bit about like when we talk about this idea of precarious masculinity, how do you understand that?
That's a good question. The way that I think of that is like that very stereotypical, like the strength, um, that almost like a hierarchy, if I'm understanding that correctly.
A hierarchy in what sense?
So like that hierarchy in terms of like that traditional, like
Mm,
male head of household, the
mhm,
female, not like the stay-at-home mom, but almost like that, right? Like it's an unspoken. levels of I'm the man of the house, like I deserve respect, like I very stoic, right? Like that stoicism.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the indicators of precarious masculinity, and what that word means in this context, precarious masculinity, is that it's precarious because it needs to be proven over and over and over again, right? And if it's not proven, there's a fear that it might not exist. And so when we think about the performative nature of masculinity, a lot of times that includes exactly what you just said, right? Feelings of extreme competition, needing to feel dominant or hierarchically more established than someone else. Um, a lot of men will look to their agility or their proficiency in some sort of sport or physical activity as a demonstration of their masculinity or performance of it. They'll look at their sexual virility as something that proves that they are a man, right? If I have sex this many times, or with women who are like this, or, whatever the tropes go, however the tropes go, then that can be seen as proof that they are man enough, right? Can you think of any others?
Um, Having like that higher paying job, right? Like the corporate
Mm-hmm.
versus, I mean, even being a construction worker, right? Like the businessman type of appeal. Even everything you said about maybe like having um more women partners, being more promiscuous,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Yeah, those are, and I think with even with what you said about the sports and like the more agility in sports, that response was also actually touched upon in your Instagram
It
post and how
was.
they had responded. Somebody had responded to it that way, and that's what came up to me too. Um, and
Which response did you see?
yes,
Let's find it and
let,
read it.
yes, it says toxic masculinity traits ingrained from playing sports. I
Mm.
loathe the be tough, only pussies cry type of ideologies.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
again,
right?
like you fall, you pick yourself up, you dust it off, and then you're good to go. Whereas like
Right.
internally, you may really be hurting and you may want to like talk to somebody about it, but you can't.
Right. I mean, not only internally, emotionally, but physically, people get so injured in sports and
Mhm.
they are conditioned away from talking about it or taking it seriously. I mean, so many men um, refuse to get health care or mental health care, or they delay it because
Yes.
it contradicts the idea of being tough and just being stoic and getting over things and not being bothered and having to always seem like you are okay and in control. And that just creates so much pressure internally for men. And we see it in their mental health, and we see it in the way they're showing up in relationships.
Mhm. And that's exactly what I was thinking next is you brought up that idea of going to the doctor, but I also think
Mm-hmm.
the stigma for men entering therapy
Mm-hmm.
is also very tough. They may find it difficult to even open up within the room, and I wonder even with a female identified therapist how if they feel like that even deepens what they're feeling too. Like if they find it harder with a female therapist versus with a male therapist, if that would look any different.
That's so interesting that you bring that up. I don't know what the exact stats are on that, but I do remember reading an article a while ago that some men looked at having a female therapist as a lot easier, actually, because they see women as having access to emotions and being safe people with whom to be more vulnerable. That is often a place where men do get some of their vulnerability needs met, is through their romantic or sexual relationships with women. So it would make sense that in a professional relationship with a therapist, they might also feel like it's more accessible and they might not be as judged. Now, on the flip side, some men do find it really difficult to open up to women because they are afraid they'll be shamed, or it might touch too closely on a fear that they'll be perceived as inadequate or not good enough by women. And if that's something that they're struggling with in their personal lives, it might really feel a lot safer to work with a male therapist.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And as you're talking about like the flip side of both, I'm almost wondering about the flip side of working with a man, almost feeling like you have to measure up to that man
Mm-hmm.
identity a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
and be a little bit more stoic. Like I wonder how that would show up if that's also the pros and cons of both.
Totally. There could be a lot more peacocking in the room
Yeah.
if both a male therapist and a male client are a little bit less aware of how some of that stuff might be present for them.
Yeah.
So, Raquel, for the bulk of our conversation, I've been operating under the assumption that we're talking about cisgender men. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. What information did you find about trans men and their experience in their relationships with vulnerability or emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I would say when I did try to do some research on that, there was not a substantial amount of research about trans
Mm-hmm.
men and their relationship with emotional intelligence or vulnerability and how they express that or articulate that through like a day to
Mm-hmm.
day,
Mm-hmm.
which I feel like that's almost telling enough in itself. The fact that there needs to be more research, there should be more research, and the fact that within male identified, whether it's trans identified men, like anything like that, like however you identify, it is still such a fresh topic and it's like with all that shame. So it would be hard whether or not to know whether or not they do experience vulnerability in that same way, at least at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's really just a dearth of research in general about the trans community. And if anyone listening is working on a dissertation, this could be a great research topic to get more clarity around whether or not there is a discrepancy or a disparity between how cis and trans men negotiate vulnerability.
Yeah, and I would also be interested too for anybody who's listening that does identify as a trans man. I would be interested in hearing your experiences either in the comments or an email or whatever that looks like, just so that we can also represent you in the best light possible too.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Um, okay, so what about folks of other genders?
Yeah. Um,
Can they be vulnerable? Do they struggle with vulnerability?
I say that this is universal against all genders.
Hmm.
I don't think it matters how you identify. Sometimes, I mean, the reality of it is it is hard to be vulnerable.
Right.
You know, I myself have had difficulty being vulnerable, especially in certain situations, certain people. Um, it is a scary thing.
It is. Yeah. Of course, it's a universal human experience, right? That it's
Mhm.
scary to be vulnerable. By
Yeah.
definition, it's
Hmm.
vulnerable to be vulnerable. Um,
Yeah.
but definitely, I think that cisgender men really have been so shorted in the ways
Yes.
that they've been conditioned to understand themselves and emotional and relational intelligence that, of course, not all men, but so many of them struggle in these really big ways.
Hmm.
And it's not conscious, and it doesn't make them bad people, of course, but it really can get in the way of them having really thriving professional lives. It can get in the way of them having thriving relationships, friendships, and to really have a sense of how well they even know themselves sometimes and their ability to set boundaries. I mean, what else do you see in your work with men about how not allowing themselves to be vulnerable can impact them or their relationships?
I think that you touched on a really good one in terms of not being able to know yourself.
Mm,
That is what I've seen in my work with some of my male clients is it is difficult to be able to articulate what you're feeling. And with that, I want to say many of the times it's easy for them to describe happy, sad, angry,
mm-hmm,
scared, right? Like those are all like easy to identify with. But I do want to heighten more on the anger. I think a lot
mm-hmm,
of times for male identified folks, it's easy to identify with anger more because it is more acceptable, right?
right.
And with that, there is a sense of disconnect where it can be difficult to have that interoception of like what is going on in your body, or, oh, I'm feeling something in my chest, or like my hands are getting shaky or sweaty, but I don't know why, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I want to say it's not a matter of when these emotions come up, because we're all human, right? Like they are
Mm-hmm.
going to show up. So it's a matter
Right.
of if. So
It's a
if
matter of
we,
when, you mean?
yes, thank you. Thank you for that correction. It's a matter of when. Yes. So if we want to be able to live with in accordance with those very human emotions,
Mm-hmm.
being our authentic selves and actually being able to like live those fulfilling lives, other than how society says we should or shouldn't, right? Because it's about how it's our experience, their experience. Um, yeah, and something, I would say something else that's been pretty big that I've seen is metaphorically, right? I like that metaphor that you use, so I'm also going to use one. So think about a door that's locked. You finally
Mm-hmm.
get it open and you open it up, and there's either a brick wall behind it or a door that's locked and you need another key. That's almost what I found in stories that I've heard with men being able to express it, like their vulnerability.
Mm.
So it's like they open up one door, but it's like, oh, there's another door behind it. There's another door behind that, because it is their way of self-protection.
Of course, yeah, makes sense, right? When I think about the ways that men are often told to man up, grow up, all the things that they're told that basically says to them in so many words, don't feel your feelings, just
Mhm.
be okay. Every single instance of that is a kind of little t trauma, in my opinion, because it
Mhm.
separates someone from their organic experience and tells them that it's wrong or bad. And so it makes so much sense to me that, and I love your metaphor, that they would have so many doors and so many locks and so many
Mhm.
barricades that protect them before anybody's able to really see the quick,
Mhm.
the really painful quick behind all of those protections. It's scary.
Yeah, it is.
Mm.
And I think with that being said, that really impacts like your mental health too. I know that you
Mhm.
have some statistics on suicide that you had wanted to share. And I, when a man is not allowed to be vulnerable, their mental health can drastically take a turn for the worse. It's
Mhm.
very easy for that to happen.
Mhm.
And in the research that I found in 2018, which if you think about it, it's really not that long ago,
No, less
right?
than 5 years. Mhm.
Yeah. So in that research, men died 3.5 times more often than women by suicide.
Wow. Mhm.
And that is very significant. And we already know that suicide is such a huge epidemic in today's world,
We do.
right?
We do. Yeah. I'm so glad that you're bringing that up because men are, even though women attempt suicide more often, men are 3.88% more likely to die from completed suicide in
Mhm.
the most recent statistics that I saw coming from 2020. And interestingly, they attribute that to the fact that more men than women are gun owners. And roughly 53% of suicides that were completed in 2020 were from gun violence. And of the suicides in 2020, white men made up almost 70% of them. So there definitely is a disparity here and a pain that is very clearly being expressed in the form of these fatal experiences.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say it's not just men that have to, it's not even I don't necessarily like that language in terms of how I'm trying to say this, but it's not men that are like wanting to make that change. I believe that also like all genders, that it should be women that also should try to be more understanding, more open-minded, less judgmental, to actually provide that space for men. Because if that space was allowed or thought like perceived to be allowed, right, then I
Mhm.
wonder how much these numbers would change.
Well, I hear you, and I want to maybe just offer a little bit of an additional thought to that. So many of the women who I've worked with professionally, and the women in my personal lives, and certainly the research shows that women do hold space for men far more than men hold space for men. Right. So certainly there can be women out there who are judgmental and who shame men. And I would say those women have an incredible amount of internalized misogyny within themselves. Right. And so they are acting from a place of their own conditioning that men have to be one way and women have to be another way. And it's, it's harmful to everybody on all sides of that dichotomy when they're stuck in it. Which is why we've got to unravel so much of the ways in which we're socialized into these gender roles. But definitely, I think one of the things that's so necessary is for women to continue to encourage men to be vulnerable, but also I think for men to jump into that space with each other, right? Because so many men, especially men with higher affiliations with hostile or ambivalent sexism, they'll rely on women to do the emotional labor for them, right? But they won't take women seriously when they talk about how they want men to sort of be more vulnerable. So it's a bit of a catch-22, right? And so that's why it's so important for men to step up for each other and really model a different kind of masculinity, a masculinity that is warm, that is compassionate, that is protective of one another, and not in a way that hurts other people, but in a way that holds each other up.
Yeah, I agree. And I love that so much. Especially us being human beings, we do learn by modeling, right? Like we learn by the interactions that we see, the things that we hear, how we see other people treating other people. And I think that could be groundbreaking too, if they see other men like modeling that for them.
Yeah, there are some men who do. They have online platforms, they have written books, right? They are modeling healthy masculinity, and they're modeling a different way to be. And when you talk to men who are in that space, oh my God, their lives are so much more rich. They feel so much more expressive. Their relationships are more reciprocal. They don't have as many resentments toward a partner because they're not feeling tasked to do all of these kinds of things, whatever these things might be that are thrown in the category of these are men's things, right? There's more mutuality and there's more acceptance of who they are at their core. And it's just such a gift to be able to be a part of a man's journey and watch him open up those parts of himself. At least for me, it is.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, when men bring up difficulties expressing vulnerability in sessions with you, how do you help them move through that?
The very first thing that I make sure I do is I want to make sure that I validate the normalcy in the struggle. I think that is huge for like setting the scene.
It is.
And especially as we've been talking about, right, that men are taught to bury their emotions because it makes them seem, right, like weak in the eyes of others. So that is the first place where I start. And I say that because I can tell you over and over again, like how normal it is, but until you or they, right, until they are actually able to kind of tease out that shame that comes with it, it's not really going to mean more than just words. So sometimes even if I have to repeat myself and continue to validate, we can kind of go from there. And in terms of interventions, I would say starting small, right? I think pacing and
what does that mean?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. In terms of pacing, it's going at their pace, right? So I'm not going to force you to, okay, let's have a conversation with your partner or your loved ones or XYZ. I just want you to start right away. Because that can seem like jumping all the way to the very top of the mountain. It can very easily overwhelm them, right?
Of course, of course.
So definitely starting small. So being able to identify what these emotions are. So something deeper than sadness or anger or happiness. Like, are you feeling fear? Are you feeling rage? Are you feeling anxiety? Are you feeling restlessness? Like talking about those emotions. And there is a body mapping exercise by M. Ducloff. It will be referenced in the show notes. But I think that the body mapping exercise is such a great way to start. It really does help. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It really does help to build up that interoception. So in being able to identify first what these emotions are,
Mm-hmm.
how you're feeling them, when you're feeling them, where you're feeling them,
Mm-hmm.
those are the best way to learn about how to not only talk about those feelings, but also how to articulate them and identify where they are.
I am so glad that you're bringing this up, Raquel, because
Yeah.
it's, I think, one of the biggest foundational building blocks for people
Mhm.
to be able to embrace vulnerability, but also to be able to develop greater emotional intelligence and to be able to communicate what they're feeling more effectively. And
Mhm.
so many men, because they're told, don't feel like that, don't act like that, all the things that they are told that again conditions them away from their emotional experience, it's
Mhm.
actually left so many men with what's called normative male alexithymia. And I wrote an article about that in Psychology Today, maybe about a year ago. It'll be in the show notes for anyone who wants to read it. But alexithymia basically means that a person has a difficult time recognizing what emotions they're feeling, labeling them, or communicating them. So this conditioning around being tough or being stoic actually in many ways just emotionally prohibits men from being able to even understand their own internal experience. And so
Mhm.
starting with emotion mapping in the body is a really important place, because what is recognizable is the feeling of distress in the body. And
Mhm.
usually men can recognize, oh yeah, I am feeling some tension in my chest, or I am feeling something in my stomach. It feels kind of hot or like it's moving a bit, right? Or tension in the back of my neck, or I'm clenching my fists. And learning how to understand the ways that our body communicates emotions, and then what emotions our body is communicating to us, is the starting point to being okay with being able to communicate them to other folks and getting help.
Yes, exactly. And with that, I would also lead with more validation that they are going to fumble. Again, it's not a matter of if, right? Like you will
Mm-hmm.
fumble. This will be new to you. It is going to feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But through that discomfort, there will be growth. And it's not always going to feel uncomfortable. At some point, it will start to feel like second nature.
Mm-hmm.
But really to not give up because you are feeling discomfort, like, oh, it's not working, it doesn't feel right, like that pushback, I would kind of challenge you to continue to ride with that resistance.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the definition of vulnerability, right? If it didn't
Yeah,
feel uncomfortable and vulnerable, we would call it confident.
right,
Right.
exactly.
And the beauty of embracing vulnerability and accepting it is that you get the permission that you need as a human to just make mistakes or to be imperfect. And
Yeah,
that is an incredibly liberating gift.
yeah, I think that is also very empowering
Mhm.
because there are so many people, like men, right, that they're like, wow, you mean I'm allowed to mess up and it doesn't make me less than, or
Mhm.
I'm allowed to mess up and cry and you're still gonna love me. Like
Mhm.
that's huge.
I love that you're bringing that up. It reminds me of a video I saw on TikTok, because TikTok is the source of all things news.
Hmm. Yes, it is.
um, but I saw this really beautiful video on TikTok, and I can't remember the poster's handle, which is unfortunate, but it went viral. So if anybody remembers it, please comment in the show notes. But it was a woman who was taking video of her husband just sobbing into her chest after she had just given birth. And he was just so beautifully overwhelmed with feelings and just vulnerably sobbing with gratitude and fear and amazement and all the things that he was feeling. He was just letting it be present and known. And the comment section was just glorious, right? So many of the women in the comment section were loving it. They were reveling in his vulnerability, enjoying it, and saying things like, I wish my husband was like that. I wish that my boyfriend would show me his feelings like that. And I know so many men fear the way that women will judge them. But I think that while there are emotionally immature women who will judge, the majority of women are craving for men to show up in these vulnerable ways that really allow them to be connected with.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful story. And I think with that fear, if I could even give a little bit more advice, test the waters a little bit, right? Like dip your toe in the water. Like you don't have to share your deepest, darkest like secret, right? Maybe share something small, see how your partner reacts, and then go from there. Like again, that's kind of what going at your paces and finding your comfort level. But I think not only your comfort level, but your partner's comfort level as well. Because I think you both have to be in the mindset to kind of have that conversation before it starts to become normal for you both.
Totally. I mean, I love that you're saying that, because whenever we have been in a status quo for however long we've been in a status quo, doing something different is going to shake up the dynamic in a relationship, whether that's addressing vulnerability or loading the dishwasher as you go throughout the day versus at the end of the night, right? Like the dynamic changes when we make changes, and that's a good thing. So it can be really helpful to give your partner a heads up that you're going to be trying something different and communicating yourself in a different way, so that one, your partner can attune to you, they can support you, and they understand that this is a new muscle that you're developing. And so sometimes it might be clumsy, because guess what? We all are clumsy sometimes.
Right. And I love how you say it is a muscle, right? So like think about it like working out. You know, like you're not going to just be like big and buff and toned and strong like right away. Like it takes time to kind of build that up, right? And your brain is really the same way. Your brain is a muscle just like any other part in your body.
It absolutely, right. We can strengthen those neural pathways and make it more of an automatic habit once we practice it. Yeah. What other tips do you have for men who are just learning how to discuss their vulnerabilities with a partner, with a friend, with family?
Yeah, I think exactly. I did kind of jump ahead of myself, right? Exactly how I just mentioned a little bit ago, making sure that both you and your partner are in the right headspace. So I didn't really talk much about like what that would look like. So really that could look anything, right? Like, hey, I have some things that I would like to share with you. Can we try to talk after dinner? Can we try to talk after you shower? Can we try to talk when you're getting ready for bed? Any way that feels comfortable for you to kind of pose that question. And the reason I'm really heightening it on this is because let's say your partner just gets home from work, or your loved one just gets home from work, and they had like a really stressful day, and you're just like bubbling with so much excitement to, oh, this is what I learned today, I want to share something with you. And then you don't get the response that you wanted. That could also be so like detrimental, and it's like that negative reinforcement to, see, this is exactly why I don't talk about my feelings to anyone, because it's never well received.
Right.
Or any of those things. So I think making sure that the tone is set for both you and your partner, knowing the audience, kind of feeling the vibe out in the room, whatever it is, like there is an appropriate time for that.
I love that. That's great relational hygiene, no matter what you're talking about. But definitely, if there's something really important that you want to share with partners, it's good to check in with them and let them know there's something important first, so that they can tell you if they have the bandwidth to be present with you for it. Because to your point, so many men who I work with will come back into a session and they'll say something like, I was vulnerable with my partner and she told me that I was gaslighting her, that I was invalidating her. And so we'll explore it a little bit more. And how they chose to be vulnerable was to levy their vulnerability as a deflection to something their partner was bringing to their attention, right? So it could sound like a partner saying, hey, I felt really disappointed when you blah, blah, blah. And so then they might say, well, I feel really, vulnerable when you blah, blah, blah. And so they're bringing it up at a time when it sounds like they're trying to get out of being accountable, and that can really make it hard for a partner to hear their vulnerability. So I often, tell anybody, regardless of their gender, but when you're trying to bring something up, it's important that you bring it up as its own issue, not in response to something that someone's bringing to you, right? Keep your fighting fair and your arguments clear from the clutter of all different kinds of history and separate events that are not related. Stay present with the issue at hand. And when you come to a partner, when it's not in response to something they've brought to you, and you say, hey, I feel really bummed out about something that you said to me yesterday, and I wonder if we can talk about it for a little bit. That's a really different conversation than someone saying, hey, can you load the dishwasher tonight? And then you saying, you never appreciate me. And that's me being vulnerable.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. They can easily get misconstrued. So I really like the fact that you take the time, right, to break that down with that part, with the client that you're talking about, because really breaking down that situation sometimes has to be done. I think it helps to give more direction so that they can walk out of that situation feeling happy and content and like they got what they wanted
or what they needed.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the word is that you're looking for, but when I hear you say that, I hear we want to feel like we are attuned to. We want to feel like our partner hears us, sees us, understands us. And so how we communicate ourselves plays a big part in whether or not we will be seen and heard and understood in the ways that we are hoping. So it's so important to use I statements instead of blaming you statements. That's so key. And to develop a vocabulary about your emotions that helps you stay accountable for your own feelings, right? I think it's so easy. All of us, regardless of gender, can be so quick to say, you always do this, or you do that, or you never this, blah, blah, blah. But when we do that, we immediately put our partner on the defense. And that's not really being vulnerable. It's being accusatory.
Yeah. And I think then along with that is another tip is to also be consistent.
What does that mean in this context?
Yeah. So to be consistent in this context is along those lines of it may feel uncomfortable, but don't stop, continue. So to be consistent, don't give up. If you fumble, or if you are having a hard time articulating, or maybe if you're still learning the language around it and your partner maybe misunderstands what you were saying, don't give up. Just be consistent. And, at some point, you're going to get it right. You and your partner kind of got to find your groove. That's what all of this is about.
I love that. You've got to find a balance. And again, to the point that you made earlier, when people start making changes, it can sometimes upend the apple cart, meaning that it changes to the system of your relationship are going to be clumsy. So keep practicing until you are able to find a new groove together and give each other grace.
Yeah. All the metaphors today. I'm loving it. I live for metaphors.
So let's think about what other resources can you recommend, if any, to help men outside of this podcast or outside of therapy start to learn how to be more vulnerable and to get more familiar with what that even means for them?
Yeah, I think in some of the research that I was doing, there are a couple of really good podcasts that are actually done by men, and they will be in the show notes as well. And I think learning or listening to podcasts, that is a good way, especially from men modeling how to be vulnerable. That's huge. And there are...
What podcasts are you thinking?
Yes. So some of the blogs that I came across were Good Men Exist, the Vulnerable Man podcast, and Man Talks podcast.
Okay, great. I haven't heard of those, but I will check them out. I really like Justin Baldoni's podcast, Man Enough. I think he does such a great job of showcasing how to change your relationship with masculinity.
Yeah. There are other, which I will also link those in the show notes as well, in terms of different blogs about misconceptions about men, believing that power is strength,
Mm-hmm.
information about destigmatizing shame.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of blogs that I use to help me write my blog as well. So those are going to be in there as well.
Okay, great. So there's going to be a bunch of different blogs and podcasts and books. Do you have any book recommendations for men?
It's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck
Mm.
by Mark Manson.
Mm-hmm.
And in preparing for this podcast, one of the things, like, there was a quote that really stood out to me.
From
Are you
that
okay?
book? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you okay
Yeah.
if I recite that for you all real quick?
Yeah.
All right. It says, to deny one's negative emotions is to deny many of the feedback mechanisms that help a person to solve problems. As a result, many of these repressed individuals struggle to deal with problems throughout their lives.
Mm.
And if they can't solve problems, they can't be happy. Remember that pain serves a purpose.
I love that. I love
And
that.
I know that this book it's not all around men and vulnerability, but it is a way to learn to not give a fuck. Like, it
Which
does help to destigmatize that. And
yeah.
I think this was huge, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
because vulnerability can really trickle down to every area in your life.
Of
How
course.
you mentioned before, like in your work, in your relationship, to not even just romantic, just how you relate to
Mhm.
other human beings in general, right?
Totally. Totally. Yeah, I think I love that. That book is so great, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And when I reframe that in more like clinical language, it's really
Yes.
about radical acceptance. And
Yes.
it's about
Yeah.
learning how to just be okay with who you are and kind of where you are in life. And I think that's a helpful reframe instead of putting
Mhm.
so much pressure on yourself or shooting all over yourself to
Yeah.
try to get to some imagined place of achievement that's going to make everything okay.
Yeah. And I think what is so beautiful is that so often people of all genders, it's not even just men, we
Hmm.
get our validation and our meaning and purpose externally. And I
Yes.
think when you do develop that radical acceptance and learning to validate yourself, what
Hmm.
other people really say doesn't matter, because this is my life. I'm happy. I don't really care what you say. I'm going to cry if I want to cry, and that's okay. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I'll just throw in here as we inch closer to the end of our episode is that
Mhm.
when I work with men around this topic, around learning how to be more vulnerable, there's usually some fear that takes the form of resistance or
Mm.
dismissiveness at the start of our work. And toward the end of our work and therapy together, I usually hear men saying things like, wow, I was so limited before and I didn't even know it. Or they'll say things like, oh my God, I am experiencing life with so much more color now, and my life is so
Yeah.
much more meaningful now that I've given myself permission to tap into these different aspects of who I am and these different aspects of my experience. A lot of them tell me they have better sex than they've ever had before, ever.
Mhm.
And you're nodding, right? Have you heard that too?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think vulnerability leads to better sex?
I really think it's because you're not holding back
Hmm.
anymore. The fact that you can be so raw, so that shows up in the relationship, even in the smallest ways. And that's
Hmm.
why having these types of conversations are so important, because if you don't have that emotional intimacy there, the physical intimacy can still be good, right? Of
Hmm.
course. But when you add on that layer of emotional intimacy and rawness and being authentic and being able to be whoever you really are, it can just be explosive, right? Pun intended, but it can just be so good, like in all
Yeah.
aspects.
Totally, totally, right? It removes that performance piece and
Yeah.
allows us to be a participant in pleasure. And
Mhm.
we feel so much more comfortable and confident with the things that can go wonky during sex too. Like,
Yeah.
maybe your body isn't responding the way you want it to, or maybe you haven't reached orgasm as quickly as you would like, or it's happened faster than you would like.
Yeah.
Um, or,
Or Yeah, like, or you're asking for something that maybe so like what society says that like men shouldn't want or like or ask for, and if that's what brings you pleasure, like whatever it is that brings you pleasure, like ask for it. It makes having those conversations easier.
Totally. Totally. Well, Raquel, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I feel so honored to talk with you about the blog that you wrote and to know that you are working with folks to really help them access their deeper, vulnerable parts.
Yeah, I really appreciated being here. It was an honor for me as well. I was able to learn more as I talk with you, and I hope that our listeners got the same thing from it.
I hope so too. Where can folks reach you if they want to schedule a consultation with you?
Yeah, I know that the best way of doing that is the info@modernintimacy.com, or my email is just Raquel@modernintimacy. Read my blogs. If there's any other questions about any of the work that I do, reach out to Kayla, and I'm here for it.
Great. Yeah, for anyone looking to create a consultation with Raquel, you can go to our website at modernintimacy.com/contact and schedule a consultation with a member of our team. And Raquel's blogs are all so amazing. Please check them out on our website as well. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Intimacy Podcast. On Instagram, follow me at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and at The Modern Intimacy. On TikTok, check me out at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and on Twitter at Kate Balestrieri. Everyone has questions about mental health, sex, and relationships. Send yours to me via DM on Instagram or email them to questions@modernintimacy.com and I'll answer some at the end of each episode. Visit the website, modernintimacy.com, to schedule a consultation with a member of our team or to sign up for our newsletter. Let's meet back here next week. New episodes air every Tuesday. Reminder, this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for mental health services.